Picture this. Karen storms up waving papers screaming, "You're living illegally in my HOA," and calls a tow truck to remove my car from my own driveway. Bad news for her, my house isn't in her HOA. 3 minutes later, garage opens, monitors light up, real sheriff badge appears. Stay for the handcuff click. What state are you watching from? Subscribe to La HOA Karen Stories 88. The smell of burnt toast still lingered in my kitchen when I heard the commotion outside. Through my window, I watched Karen Kingsley march across my front yard like she owned the place, clutching a thick stack of papers and wearing what looked like a security badge that probably came from a costume shop. The morning sun glinted off her shiny new clipboard as she positioned herself between my truck and the street cell phone already pressed to her ear. I'd been living in this quiet neighborhood for 8 years, training tactical officers for the county sheriff's department, and this was definitely a first. Karen had moved in 6 months ago and immediately appointed herself HOA, president of a community that frankly had been doing just fine without her management style. I stepped onto my porch with my coffee mug, genuinely curious about whatever drama was unfolding. Karen spotted me and pointed dramatically, her voice carrying across the morning air like she was announcing the evening news. "You there," she shouted, waving her papers like they were some kind of legal weapon. "You're in violation of multiple HOA regulations and you're trespassing on community property." I nearly choked on my coffee. My house, which I'd bought fair and square 8 years ago, was apparently now part of her jurisdiction. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone who made a living teaching de-escalation tactics was about to become the center of whatever this was. I could see curtains twitching in neighboring windows as the free entertainment began, and somewhere in the back of my mind I was already calculating how this would play out. Within minutes, a tow truck rumbled down our normally peaceful street, its diesel engine announcing Karen's next move to the entire neighborhood. The driver, a weathered guy named Eddie, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, climbed out and started assessing my perfectly legally parked vehicle. Karen strutted over to him, her plastic badge catching the sunlight as she gestured wildly at my truck and then at her stack of papers. From where I stood, I could hear fragments of her demands: immediate removal, violation of community standards, unauthorized parking, and something about property values. Eddie looked uncomfortable, the kind of uncomfortable that comes from being asked to do something that doesn't feel quite right. Current housing market stress and neighbor disputes have been skyrocketing across America, with HOA overreach becoming a genuine concern as people struggle with rising costs and community tensions. The situation escalated when Karen noticed my 10-year-old son Owen watching from our window, his baseball glove still hanging from his backpack by the door. She marched over and grabbed the bag, claiming it was blocking the sidewalk and violated some imaginary aesthetic code. That's when the temperature in my veins dropped about 10 degrees. You can mess with me, you can wave papers and call tow trucks, but the moment you involve my kid, we're playing a completely different game. I'd spent years learning to channel anger into systematic problem solving, and this was about to become a textbook example. Owen's face appeared in the window, confused and a little scared, and I gave him a reassuring nod while my mind shifted into tactical mode. Everything changed when Deputy Lyle Brooks pulled up in his patrol car, responding to what was probably Karen's dramatic call about trespassing and community security threats. Karen immediately rushed over to him, gesturing wildly, and demanding he arrest me for various imaginary crimes. I could see Brooks trying to make sense of her rapid-fire accusations about jurisdiction, property rights, and community safety. That's when I reached into my wallet and pulled out my county sheriff's department tactical training instructor ID, the one that gave me access to the same building where Deputy Brooks reported for duty every morning. "Hey there, Lyle," I said calmly as he approached. "Remember that neutralization technique you struggled with last month?" Brooks stopped mid-stride, his entire demeanor shifting as recognition hit. "Good morning, Instructor Grant," he replied formally. Eddie, the tow truck driver, heard this exchange and immediately began unhooking his equipment from my vehicle. The real show started when I pulled out my garage door remote and pressed the button. As the door rolled up, it revealed something that made everyone on the street stop and stare, a wall of monitors showing multiple camera angles of everything that had just happened. Karen slapping papers on my door, Karen showing off her fake badge, Karen grabbing Owen's baseball bag, and Karen demanding my vehicle be towed from my own property. Every angle was crystal clear, every word recorded, and best of all, everything was being live-streamed directly to my attorney Avery Chen and the county recorder's office. The look on Karen's face when she realized she'd been performing for an audience she hadn't expected was absolutely priceless. In an era where Ring doorbells and security cameras have become as common as mailboxes, especially with rising concerns about neighborhood safety and break-ins, my setup wasn't unusual, just more comprehensive than most. What really made the crowd gathering on the sidewalk take notice was when Hamid Rahman, who owns the corner market and has been a pillar of this community for 15 years, stepped out of his shop and walked over. "In this country," he said in his measured voice that carried the authority of someone who'd built his American dream from scratch, "the law is the law, not whatever gets posted in neighborhood Facebook groups." His words cut through the morning air like they were settling a debate that extended far beyond my driveway. With current tensions around immigration policy and community integration, Hamid's intervention resonated with neighbors who understood that property rights and legal processes protect everyone regardless of background. Karen's face flushed red as she realized her carefully orchestrated drama was backfiring spectacularly with the very community she claimed to protect, now questioning her authority and methods. Within an hour of the driveway confrontation, Karen and her ally Dylan Hart had launched what they probably thought was a sophisticated social media campaign. Their next-door post painted me as a dangerous squatter who was threatening neighborhood security and property values. The timing was calculated to tap into current anxieties about rising crime rates, housing instability, and economic uncertainty that have many Americans on edge. Dylan, who apparently had nothing better to do than manage Karen's online reputation, crafted posts designed to trigger every fear suburban homeowners have been harboring since the pandemic changed everything. They used phrases like unknown individuals, suspicious activity, and community safety concerns, knowing these buzzwords would get shares from neighbors worried about their investments and their children's safety. I watched their campaign unfold from my kitchen table while methodically building my own documentation. Instead of engaging in their social media circus, I did what my training had taught me: follow proper procedures and let evidence speak for itself. I filed an incident report with the Sheriff's Department requesting Deputy Brooks include our interaction in his daily logs and secure the body cam footage according to standard chain of custody protocols. My attorney Avery Chen received copies of everything within 2 hours, along with a formal request for legal counsel regarding harassment and false claims of authority. While Karen and Dylan were busy manufacturing outrage online, I was building a case file that would hold up in any court or administrative hearing. The first crack in their social media strategy appeared when Dylan overplayed his hand, posting that I had displayed a fake badge to intimidate law enforcement. Deputy Brooks, who takes police impersonation very seriously, immediately pulled his body cam footage and posted a brief statement clarifying that I had shown legitimate county sheriff's department credentials and that he had addressed me as Instructor Grant. The post went up on the department's official social media accounts, complete with badge numbers and case file references. Nothing deflates false accusations quite like official documentation, and Dylan's post suddenly looked like what it was: a desperate attempt to manufacture a crisis where none existed. Current concerns about misinformation and social media manipulation made the community particularly sensitive to obvious fabrications, especially when they involved law enforcement. Karen responded to this setback by doubling down, sending me what she claimed was a cease and desist letter demanding I stop interfering with HOA business and threatening legal action for disrupting community harmony. The letter was printed on letterhead she'd apparently designed herself, complete with official-sounding language about jurisdiction and enforcement authority. I forwarded it to Avery, who responded with the legal equivalent of a mic drop, a single sentence, asking Karen to cite the specific statute or covenant that granted her any authority over my property. The silence that followed was deafening. Meanwhile, I installed a QR code next to my front door that linked directly to the county parcel map and exemption documentation, letting anyone with a smartphone verify the facts for themselves instead of relying on neighborhood gossip. The real turning point came during what Hamid Rahman organized as a backyard community discussion about property rights and neighborhood cooperation. About 20 neighbors showed up, representing the demographic cross-section that makes suburban America work: working families, retirees, small business owners, and people who just want to live peacefully without drama. The conversation naturally drifted toward recent tensions about community security, property values, and the balance between collective standards and individual rights. Mrs. Whitcomb, a retired teacher whose husband had been dealing with health issues, quietly mentioned how stressed she'd been about Karen's threatening letters regarding her lawn maintenance during a particularly difficult period caring for her spouse. The room went silent as people realized this wasn't an isolated incident. What emerged from that gathering was a community that had been quietly dealing with Karen's overreach for months but hadn't known how to respond. Dylan's security patrol suggestions, Karen's arbitrary fines for imaginary violations, and her habit of photographing people's properties without permission had created an atmosphere of surveillance and anxiety that nobody had signed up for. When Eddie, the tow truck driver, showed up to apologize for his part in the morning's events and explain how Karen had pressured him with threats about losing HOA business, the picture became complete. This wasn't about community standards or property values. It was about someone using fear and confusion to accumulate power over neighbors who just wanted to live their lives. The evening ended with several people quietly asking Hamid for information about property rights and legal protections, while Karen's text messages to the newly formed security HOA group chat went largely unanswered. Tuesday morning brought the documentation I'd been waiting for. Paula Mendez from the county recorder's office delivered both digital and certified physical copies of my property's exemption certificate. The paperwork was comprehensive, including detailed parcel maps, historical ownership records, and a clear statement that my address had never been included in any homeowner association, covenant, or agreement. But Paula had discovered something even more interesting while researching my case. Karen had been using an incorrect legal form for her notices, and several other addresses in the neighborhood had received similar overreach communications. The pattern suggested either complete incompetence in understanding property law or a deliberate strategy to expand HOA authority beyond its legal boundaries. The exemption certificate was like having a golden ticket in a chocolate factory, except instead of candy, I was about to unwrap a systematic demolition of Karen's entire power structure. Paula's research revealed that the original HOA agreement from 1987 had specific geographical boundaries that excluded several properties, including mine. But Karen had been operating as if the entire zip code fell under her jurisdiction. More troubling was evidence that she'd been collecting fees from some of these excluded properties and threatening legal action against homeowners who questioned her authority. With current concerns about regulatory overreach and bureaucratic accountability resonating across America, this kind of systematic abuse of quasi-governmental power struck a nerve with neighbors who were already feeling overwhelmed by rising costs and administrative burdens. That evening's impromptu town hall meeting in Mrs. Whitcomb's backyard drew nearly 40 residents, twice the number from our previous gathering. The conversation started with property boundaries but quickly expanded to broader concerns about accountability, transparency, and the difference between community cooperation and authoritarian control. Mrs. Whitcomb shared her story about being threatened with fines for lawn maintenance while caring for her terminally ill husband, and the silence that followed was the kind that changes everything. When people realized that Karen's power grab had been targeting the most vulnerable members of their community, the collective mood shifted from irritation to genuine anger. Hamid Rahman spoke about his experience as a small business owner dealing with actual regulatory compliance, contrasting legitimate authority with the arbitrary rulemaking they'd been experiencing. Karen's response to the exemption certificate was to file an emergency motion in civil court, claiming that neighborhood aesthetic standards superseded individual property rights and that my non-compliance was damaging community property values. Her motion included dramatic language about precedent community standards and the need for swift judicial intervention to prevent neighborhood deterioration. Avery Chen's response was swift and devastating. A motion to dismiss based on lack of standing, absence of covenant privity, and failure to demonstrate any actual damages. The legal brief included copies of the exemption certificate parcel maps and documentation of Karen's systematic misrepresentation of her authority. When Karen showed up to court wearing her fake badge and carrying a binder of photographs showing minor variations in landscaping and vehicle parking, the judge's expression suggested this wasn't going to go the way she'd hoped. The real bombshell came from an unexpected source. One of our neighbors had been documenting Karen's behavior for weeks, including cell phone footage of her practicing arrest procedures in her backyard while wearing her costume badge. The video showed her rehearsing dramatic confrontations, practicing citizens' arrest speeches, and testing different positions for her fake credentials. This wasn't someone who had gradually overstepped boundaries. This was someone who had systematically planned to assume authority she didn't possess. Deputy Brooks, who had been watching these developments with professional interest, suggested that the sheriff's department might want to conduct an audit of HOA activities, particularly focusing on any claims of law enforcement authority or attempts to collect fees from non-member properties. The preliminary hearing lasted exactly 12 minutes. Karen's attorney, who appeared to be meeting his client for the first time, attempted to argue that HOA authority extended beyond written covenants when community welfare was at stake. Judge Martinez listened patiently before asking a simple question: could counsel please identify the specific legal mechanism that granted the HOA jurisdiction over non-member properties? The silence stretched long enough for the court reporter to look up from her keyboard. When Karen attempted to interrupt with comments about community standards and property values, the judge calmly noted that passion was not a substitute for legal authority. The motion was denied, and Karen was advised that any further attempts to assert authority over exempted properties could result in sanctions for frivolous litigation. As we left the courthouse, I noticed Karen's hands shaking as she clutched her fake badge, the reality of her situation finally beginning to penetrate her constructed worldview. I spent that weekend organizing evidence with the methodical precision that 8 years of training law enforcement officers had taught me. Color-coded tabs separated video evidence, audio recordings, photographic documentation, parcel maps, and email communications into a binder that looked like it could convict a war criminal. Each USB drive was sealed with evidence tape and labeled according to chain of custody protocols that would make any prosecutor smile. The process was oddly therapeutic, transforming weeks of harassment into a systematic demonstration of how real authority operates through documentation, proper procedures, and respect for legal boundaries rather than plastic badges and manufactured crises. Eddie, the tow truck driver, contacted me Monday morning with information that changed everything. Karen had initially hired him under false pretenses, claiming she had official authority to order vehicle removals from HOA property. When he'd asked for documentation, she'd shown him the same fake papers she'd waved at me, along with her costume badge and claims about community safety enforcement. Eddie had reluctantly agreed because towing companies rely on HOA contracts for steady business. But after witnessing our confrontation and hearing Deputy Brooks confirm my credentials, he realized he'd been manipulated into participating in what was essentially theft of services. His company was now refusing any future contracts with Karen's HOA and had reported the incident to their insurance carrier, who were asking pointed questions about liability for illegal towing operations. The HOA's next board meeting became a community referendum on Karen's leadership, with nearly 60 residents crowding into the community center that normally hosted bingo games and book clubs. Dylan Hart opened the meeting by proposing increased security fees to fund neighborhood patrols and enhanced enforcement capabilities, apparently unaware that the community mood had shifted dramatically over the past 2 weeks. When Hamid Rahman stood up with a formal petition for Karen's recall signed by 47 homeowners, the room erupted in applause. The petition detailed systematic overreach, misrepresentation of authority, harassment of non-member properties, and financial irregularities in fee collection and enforcement actions. Current concerns about accountability and leadership from local school boards to federal agencies had made the community particularly sensitive to abuse of power, regardless of the scale. I maintained my role as the calm professional throughout the chaos, contributing exactly one sentence when directly asked about my position. "This is your community and your decision. I'll simply continue following proper legal procedures and submitting documentation to the appropriate county authorities." The contrast between my measured response and Karen's increasingly frantic attempts to justify her actions was stark. She blamed outside agitators, claimed that undocumented residents were undermining community safety, and suggested that people who questioned HOA authority were probably involved in criminal activity. The audience's reaction to these desperate accusations was immediate and negative, particularly when Hamid Rahman quietly noted that his family had been documenting vandalism and petty crime in the area, and his security camera footage had helped solve 4 cases of package theft in the past year alone. Mrs. Whitcomb provided the evening's most powerful moment when a local news reporter asked her about community leadership and accountability. Her response became the soundbite that defined the entire controversy. Leadership means serving your neighbors, not commanding them, and the best communities are built on cooperation, not fear. The interview aired on 3 local stations and was shared hundreds of times on social media, becoming a rallying cry for suburban residents across the region who were dealing with similar HOA overreach issues. Meanwhile, Karen's insurance company sent a formal letter stating they would not provide coverage for any actions taken outside the scope of legitimate HOA authority, effectively cutting off her financial safety net for future legal problems. The meeting ended with a vote to suspend Karen's enforcement activities pending the completion of a county audit and the recall election. Dylan Hart, apparently sensing which way the wind was blowing, announced he was stepping back from community involvement to focus on his consulting business. As people filed out of the community center, I overheard conversations about property rights, legal procedures, and the importance of actual authority versus manufactured drama. Karen sat alone at the front table, still wearing her fake badge, apparently unable to process that her carefully constructed power structure had collapsed in less than 3 weeks. The recall petition needed 30 signatures to trigger an election, and they'd collected 47 in 2 days. Sometimes the democratic process works exactly the way it's supposed to, even at the subdivision level. The morning of the county hearing arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes everything feel possible. Karen showed up wearing her costume badge prominently displayed on a navy blazer, carrying 3 binders and trailing Dylan Hart like a reluctant bodyguard. Deputy Brooks stood next to me in full uniform, his presence adding official weight to what Karen had tried to frame as a neighborhood squabble. The hearing room was packed with residents, local media, and county officials who had become interested in this case as a potential template for addressing HOA overreach throughout the region. Current discussions about regulatory accountability and individual property rights had elevated our subdivision drama into something resembling a civic education seminar. County Administrator Patricia Voss opened the proceedings by acknowledging the community impact of this situation and emphasizing that property rights and legal authority were foundational principles that required precise documentation, proper procedures. Avery Chen presented our evidence systematically: the exemption certificate establishing my property's status outside HOA jurisdiction, bodycam footage of Karen's false claims of authority, security camera, evidence of harassment and theft, and documentation of systematic overreach affecting multiple properties. Each piece of evidence was labeled authenticated and entered into the record with the methodical precision that separates real legal proceedings from playground arguments. Karen's attorney looked increasingly uncomfortable as the presentation continued, apparently realizing that his client had provided him with a fundamentally unwinnable case. The hearing's first major revelation came when Paula Mendez presented her research into Karen's purchasing history. Public records showed that Karen had bought her security badge from an online costume supplier, along with handcuffs, a utility belt, and official-looking documentation templates. More damaging was evidence that she had created fraudulent authorization letters claiming enforcement powers granted by county authorities that had never been contacted or consulted. This wasn't overzealous community management, this was systematic impersonation of governmental authority using props that would have been obvious to anyone who bothered to verify their authenticity. The federal implications of impersonating government officials added a sobering dimension to what had started as a neighborhood dispute. The emotional climax came when Mrs. Whitcomb was invited to address the panel about community impact. Through tears, she described caring for her dying husband while being harassed about lawn maintenance by someone who claimed legal authority but was actually just a neighbor with a badge from Amazon. Her story about her late husband's fear that he would be arrested for failing to maintain property standards during his final illness left the hearing room completely silent. When she mentioned that her husband had served 2 tours in Vietnam and spent his final months worried about being criminally prosecuted for having brown spots on his lawn, several people in the audience wiped their eyes. The human cost of Karen's power fantasy became impossible to ignore or minimize. Karen's breaking point arrived when Administrator Voss asked her to explain the legal basis for her enforcement actions against exempted properties. Instead of providing documentation or legal citations, Karen launched into a rambling speech about community values, property investments, national security concerns, and the need for strong leadership in uncertain times. She claimed that immigration issues, rising crime rates, and economic instability required communities to take protective action, regardless of technical legal boundaries. As her voice rose and her arguments became increasingly disconnected from reality, Deputy Brooks stepped forward with an arrest warrant that had been prepared earlier that morning. The charges included criminal trespass, theft of personal property, and impersonation of a government official. The handcuffs closed with a metallic click that echoed through the suddenly quiet hearing room. Karen's expression shifted from defiant anger to shocked disbelief, as the reality of her situation finally penetrated the fantasy world she'd constructed around her plastic badge and self-appointed authority. The audience watched in stunned silence as Deputy Brooks professionally explained her rights and escorted her toward the exit, her costume badge finally removed and placed in an evidence bag. Dylan Hart had apparently decided this was an excellent time to discover urgent business elsewhere, and had vanished during Karen's final speech. As the hearing room slowly emptied, I overheard conversations about accountability, legal procedures, and the importance of distinguishing between legitimate authority and elaborate role-playing games with real-world consequences. The aftermath unfolded over the following weeks with the systematic efficiency that characterizes functional institutions when they finally decide to address a problem. The recall election succeeded with 73% of eligible voters supporting Karen's removal, and the HOA board was reconstituted with members committed to operating within legal boundaries and focusing on actual community needs rather than enforcement fantasies. A comprehensive audit revealed that Karen had collected over $12,000 in invalid fees from properties outside HOA jurisdiction, all of which was returned with interest. New procedures were implemented, requiring legal review of any enforcement actions and annual training on the actual scope of HOA authority. Most importantly, the county recorder's office updated their public database to clearly identify exempted properties, preventing future confusion about jurisdiction and authority. I framed the exemption certificate and hung it in my kitchen right next to Owen's baseball schedule and a photo of his team winning their regional championship. The boy who had been scared and confused by Karen's theatrical display of authority was now fascinated by the legal process that had resolved the situation through documentation and proper procedures rather than shouting matches and social media campaigns. When he asked me why the whole thing had been necessary, I explained that law is a tool for protecting people, not a weapon for controlling them, and that understanding the difference is what separates functional communities from those trapped in cycles of conflict and confusion. The exemption certificate serves as a daily reminder that property rights matter, legal procedures work, and sometimes the most effective response to manufactured drama is methodical documentation and patience with the system. 3 months later, our neighborhood has returned to the peaceful routine that originally attracted me to this community. Property values have actually increased slightly, crime remains minimal, and neighbors cooperate on genuine community issues without needing badges, enforcement actions, or dramatic confrontations. Hamid Rahman's Market continues to serve as an informal community center where people discuss local concerns and share information about resources and services. Mrs. Whitcomb tends her garden without fear of harassment, and Eddie the tow truck driver waves whenever he drives past my house. The transformation from Karen's enforcement dystopia to a normal suburban neighborhood happened remarkably quickly once people understood their rights and exercised them through proper channels. This story represents something larger than one person's power fantasy gone wrong. Across America, communities are grappling with questions about authority, accountability, and the balance between collective standards and individual rights. Whether it's school board meetings, municipal councils, or HOA disputes, we're seeing increasing numbers of people who confuse volume with authority and assume that passion justifies overreach. The antidote isn't counter-drama or social media warfare, it's the systematic application of legal knowledge, proper documentation, and respect for established procedures that protect everyone's rights regardless of their ability to shout the loudest or carry the most impressive-looking props. The real heroes in this story weren't the people with badges or titles, they were neighbors like Mrs. Whitcomb, Hamid, Rahman, and Eddie, who chose to speak truth even when it was uncomfortable, in a community that eventually chose accountability over convenience. These stories matter because they demonstrate that ordinary people can successfully challenge overreach when they understand their rights and use proper procedures instead of escalating conflicts through emotional confrontations. Every community has its potential Karens, but every community also has the tools to address them if people are willing to invest the time and effort required by democratic processes. If you've experienced similar HOA overreach, property rights violations, or abuse of authority in your community, share your story in the comments below. Your experiences help others understand their rights and recognize when authority figures have exceeded their legitimate powers. Subscribe to La OA Karen Stories 88 for more real-world examples of how legal knowledge and proper procedures can resolve conflicts that seem impossible to address through normal channels. Remember to check out our previous episodes covering everything from permit abuse to parking enforcement gone wrong, each story demonstrating different aspects of how ordinary citizens can successfully navigate bureaucratic overreach, community conflicts through understanding their rights and using appropriate legal remedies.